Hey everyone, my name is Lavonne and welcome back to my YouTube channel. I hear constantly stories about the cord around the neck, and what that means is the baby's umbilical cord that ends up around their neck, likely at their birth. Maybe this was your parents telling a story, maybe you have a friend that had this happen to, maybe their C-section correlated with it, maybe not. And so what I'm here today to do is help you understand what we're talking about, what's the incidence, what complications can it lead to, how often does it happen, and is there anything you can do to help prevent this potential problem? But before I do that, make sure you subscribe down below, and then let's get going. Before I get into this discussion about the umbilical cord being around your baby's neck during your labor and birth / during the birth in particular, I do want to give a slight trigger warning because I know that I'm about to give a lot of numbers. I will give you a little bit of a preview that this is actually a hopeful complication that most of the time doesn't turn out to be anything, but I could see there maybe being some of you where this really truly was a complication that had long-term effects on your baby or resulted in a poor outcome. And so I want to just say, take this with a grain of salt. I am giving the massive overview of what we know related to your baby having an umbilical cord around their neck. So let's talk about that complication. Now, a lot of times, we are not gonna know ahead of time that your baby has their umbilical cord around their neck. So let's think about what happens inside. So I do have all my props here. So imagine you have the placenta. Your placenta is stuck on the side of your uterus like this. There is an umbilical cord that I'm actually gonna keep the baby like this, that is connected to the placenta, and then that goes and floats around the amniotic fluid inside of your uterus and then eventually connects to their belly button. So that's why you cut the cord after the birth. This is baby's lifeline. This is how you've grown your baby. This brings all the nutrients to baby to make them bigger, chunkier, and then also brings oxygen to the baby. And we love nutrients for your baby, but we particularly like oxygen, maybe a little bit more, right? Like I can go a day without eating, but I can't go a day without breathing. So this is how your baby breathes. This is how they get oxygen and they stay alive. And so during the course of your pregnancy, baby is flipping and flopping and turning around and having the time of their life. That is normal. There's nothing wrong with that. In fact, we want them moving. But what can happen is in the process, you have this umbilical cord that somehow gets tangled around the baby's body, around a leg, around an arm, around the neck. Now, prenatally, most of the time, this doesn't really mean anything. And they may identify it on an ultrasound. Your doctor may look at the Dopplers and look at the blood flow and say, oh, it looks like the baby's cord's around your baby's neck. And that may sound really scary, but prenatally, it really doesn't mean much. It's like a noted, but nothing changes about your care. The other question I get a lot is, why does this happen, right? That is there something that I did that caused my baby to have its cord around their neck at birth? And I'll talk about the birth in a second, but I will just say this is totally random. So if this happened to you, or you heard of this happening to someone, or if it does happen to you in the future, it's entirely random. There is nothing that you did wrong to cause the cord to be around the neck. This is just because you have a really active, healthy baby, okay? Now, there is a correlation where it happens more often with long umbilical cords, which you will never know until your baby is born. So really at that point, there's nothing you could do about it. And then with babies who are extra active. Maybe for some of you, and you can let me know in the comment box down below how much your baby moved. And if you've had one baby, then you only know that baby. But maybe for those of you that have had more than one baby, was there a difference in movement between your children? And most of the time I hear the answer to that is most definitely yes. I know my nephew was like, we were like, are you okay? Hello, trying to get him to move constantly. He was super chill. Now he's not so chill, but in the womb, he was very chill. And that's just more demeanor, right? And so those that have the demeanor or the vibe that they move more, that would be correlated with more of a chance of the cord being around the neck. Now, is there anything you can do about that? No, because we actually count movements. We want movements. If your baby's not moving, that's concerning, okay? So I want you to let it go. There's nothing you can really do about it ahead of time. It's just super random. Now, the cord can be wrapped once. It can be wrapped more than once. I don't have a long enough cord to do that, right? It could be wrapped multiple times. I think the most I've ever seen in practice is 4 times around the neck. And you can imagine what's the concern here, okay? If this is baby's lifeline, right, we need oxygen to flow back and forth with this cord so easily. And the good news is, one, around the umbilical cord, and it's not on this fake cord, but if you look at your umbilical cord or a picture of umbilical cords, there's this white, tan, kind of like slimy, gooey, smushy stuff called Wharton's jelly. And that protects the vessel. So imagine if this was the arteries and vein, then you would have this stuff around the outside so that if there was some smush, guess what? It leaves some space so that the actual vessel doesn't get smushed, right? Because we want blood flow. And if we smush it, there's less or no blood flow to the baby. So we like that it already is protected in that way. The other thing that happens is you have a ton of amniotic fluid in there, hopefully a ton, not too much, not too little, but just enough that this cord can just float around. Right? If there's less, guess what? The walls of the uterus kind of close in on the cord, and that can interrupt the blood flow to the baby. All right? So you imagine if you have a cord wrapped once, that's not super tight. The moment I wrap it twice or more times, that cord is going to get more and more smushed. And that's not what we want. So the more times it's wrapped and the more tangled the baby, there is a little bit more instance of potential for complications. And you can imagine why. It's like kind of common sense. If we look at how often this is, and I hear, and this is actually my rebuttal when I have clients come to me and they're like, my baby's cord was around the neck, or I'm worried about the cord being around the neck. And I'm like, actually 20 to 24% of all births have a cord wrapped somewhere, likely around the neck, okay? That's 1/4 of all births. Now, most of the time, especially from my practice, we have zero idea until the baby's head pops out and then you look and you can actually see the umbilical cord there. Now, most of the time, the doctor's just gonna try and see if there's some slack, and sometimes you can just pull it around and then the baby delivers. No big deal, right? And that's the thing, that as long as it's not getting totally smushed, I've made up a new word, that it's really not a big deal. And it's very, very common. Most of the time, it literally has no outcome. Now, when I was looking at the actual studies of like, what are the complications? So I will tell you the risks in a second, but really the data was poor as far as being able to say that those that had the cord around the neck led to this problem. We just can't say that confidently. And most of the time what we can say is, can it happen? Can it have risk? Can it have complications? Yes. But the majority of the time, it literally has zero effect on your labor, your birth, potentially the course of your labor and birth. Now, here's where, from a medical perspective, if you're a labor and delivery nurse listening, that sometimes we will say something like, by looking at the fetal monitoring tracing, you're on continuous fetal monitoring potentially, especially in the United States, to watch the heart rate of the baby. And if we see a certain pattern, we may say something like, there's probably a cord somewhere. And you're like, logically, like, of course, I hope there's a cord somewhere in there, like providing oxygen to your baby, right? What we mean is there's probably a cord somewhere getting smushed when there's a contraction or as the baby comes down. And especially if we're seeing that specific heart rate pattern, when you're pushing, it's like their cord is getting pulled on somewhere. We can pretty confidently say that. Now, as far as if that changes anything for your labor and birth, it usually doesn't. But I will say it may, and that's where the risk for a C-section, I couldn't find any numbers on the correlation between like the number of ones with a cord around the neck that led to a C-section. What we would hear though is my baby's heart rate was dropping, or my baby's heart rate didn't look good, or they were concerned about the baby. And could the cord have contributed? Yes. Absolutely, because we need a healthy, juicy cord to be beautifully oxygenated the whole time. Now, where we really see a difference is a knot in the cord. And this is totally a tangent, But you can imagine if there's a knot somewhere in there, right? And it's floating around, and then all of a sudden contractions start happening, squeeze, squeeze, squeeze. The baby starts going down the birth canal, down, 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 down the birth canal. This really, truly does have risk to the point where it can, and most of the time most of the time does lead to an emergency C-section if the knot gets pulled like this. And you can imagine, because all of a sudden it's like we've cut off the blood flow to the baby and now the heart rate's down, and thankfully we can recognize that and get your baby out, okay? So again, not the most fun to talk about, but I also think that you are worth it to kind of give you this information so you can have an idea. And this is not beware, this is be aware, right? And what I want you to take away is that really most of the time it means nothing, okay? And you're not gonna know ahead of time. And this is one of those flex and flow moments where you're like, well, okay, we're seeing some blips in the heart rate is probably what you'll hear from your nurses. And then you'll say, well, is there anything we can do about it? Yeah. And then you do all the things like change your position or, depending on how it looks, do some other things. And then you go from there, all right? Most of the time you're still having a vaginal birth, okay? So the fun part is, what are the risks? And again, not my favorite to talk about, but to be totally frank, yes, this can lead to a neonatal demise or a stillbirth. If truly the cord is smushed somewhere, there's a knot in the cord, it's pulled tight. That's what everyone's concerned about when we're watching the heart rate, or we're looking at their growth, or we're looking at, what's the labor course look like, right? Now, if you're delivering in a hospital and you have fetal monitoring on, what I will say is that the benefit of that is that if there was this kind of a situation, we would be able to see it on the monitor and respond. I will say my very first emergency C-section was a knot in the cord, and everything was perfect. Like beyond, I was like, I was still on orientation as a new nurse. And I was like, feeling like really good. And then next thing you knew, we were in the back doing an emergency C-section and get the baby out. And sure enough, this is what we saw. And it was pulled tight. And so thank goodness we have that as an option, and why you have your team there watching closely. So that's the worst case scenario. Now, how often that happens? Very, very rarely. Okay, so yes, that's what we're concerned about, but more often we're looking at if there was decreased oxygen to the baby for a prolonged amount of time, that can lead to other complications like cerebral palsy, like developmental delays potentially, but it's really hard to know if the cord around the neck, and I'm gonna remove the knot because that's not really what we're talking about, okay? But if the cord around the neck was the reason to cause that, or if that was just a correlating factor. It's really hard to know that. The other thing they've looked at was growth restriction. So when you hear the word growth restriction, what you're thinking is a small baby. You hear like, my baby's not growing as much. Now, they may see a cord around the neck on ultrasound and see that there's a correlation with growth, but even that is not really that clear, and we really can't make that like concrete correlation that like your baby's not going to grow as much because of the cord around the neck. We can't say that. So I want to read you this piece about the risk of stillbirth just to kind of close up the conversation about risk, because I think I found this piece interesting. This comes directly from Up to Date. So the risk of stillbirth in fetuses with nuchal cords, and that's the medical terminology for cord around the neck, may depend on the number of loops present, with multiple loops and not single loops increasing the risk of stillbirth. That's sort of what I was saying, like the more times around, it may increase the risk of stillbirth. But this finding is not really an independent risk factor. So that alone, by having multiple loops of the cord around the neck, doesn't by itself increase the risk of stillbirth. So there was one meta-analysis, which is a large study, where they looked at 145 studies, including over 270,000 births. Okay, this is a humongous amount of people in this study to give us a very solid idea about the risk of stillbirth. So when they looked at the risk of stillbirth, they found that it was twofold higher in pregnancies with multiple, and so this is 2 or more cord loops rather than a single cord. But also, it wasn't statistically significant. So like the risk between the two wasn't so separate, so far apart that they were like, oh, well, clearly that's the reason, okay? So ultimately, the rate of stillbirth was similar when they looked at one versus no nuchal cord as well, okay? What does this mean? That literally, there's really nothing we can do ahead of time there's no change in prenatal care that we do, even if they know, like say that they did look, and we don't routinely look for cord around the neck, but let's just say they, for some reason, found that like, oh, the cord's around the neck, and we know that prior to labor. Nothing changes about how your care is managed, meaning you have a scheduled C-section. No, because most of the time, the baby comes out with zero effect on the labor and birth. Can it? Yes. But this is where, like, and you may be upset with me at the end of all of this, the answer to a cord around the neck that I usually will say is flex and flow. Because this is the perfect example of flex and flow, actually. If you haven't heard me say that or you haven't watched the full video on flex and flow, the idea is that we don't really know what the outcome is, but there's not enough data to tell us that we should do anything different with babies or pregnancies where we know the cord is around the neck. Everything's the same, and you sort of just have to wait and see. Now, most of the time, that does lead to a vaginal birth. I have delivered so many babies with a cord around the neck, and it becomes just like a blip on your radar. I write it down on my notes. Even in my current private clients, like most of the time, you may not even know that the baby's cord was around their neck because they see the baby come out, they just plop the cord over their head and they deliver the baby, and no one knows any different. So moral of the story is, please don't stress about this, okay? And it's something to be aware of, that it can happen. And if it happens, your provider is no matter what we're talking about, provider meaning doctor, midwife, they're very well prepared to handle a nuchal cord. And at birth, most of the time, they'll just plop it around the baby's head. Now, if the cord is really tight, they may actually clamp and cut the cord while the baby's head is still out, and then that releases the cord from being so tight around the neck. That's another way they can manage it, but they're so used to this, and it should not dictate any change in the course of care. Now, I say that with a grain of salt. This is the flex and flow piece, that like unless sometimes it can contribute. So if the heart rate of the baby is looking bad, or they're concerned, or it may lead to a C-section, they may find later and say, oh, there was a cord around the neck. And I hear people all the time be like, I had a C-section because of cord around the neck. And that is probably a contributing factor, but was that the whole story? It's sort of hard to say. More often, you had a C-section because of what we call non-reassuring fetal heart rate status, meaning we're concerned about the heart rate of the baby. Whether the cord around the neck was contributing or not, we maybe will never know. Okay, so big picture, please don't stress. It's gonna be okay. Obviously, talk to your care team if this is a concern. Ask them, how do we adjust the heart rate of the baby? Is there anything else we can be doing? And then otherwise, let it go. We're gonna flex and flow. Thanks everyone for being with me here today. If you want more from me, you know the normal spiel. Check out the description box down below. Head on over to bundlebirth.com. I have all sorts of classes over there for you to take. There's really fun products to help support your labor and birth going forward. There's also like some fun merch. I was gonna grab it, but I don't have it with me. But like some fun stickers, flex and flow, motion is lotion. It's all there to help remind you of those mantras throughout your labor and birth. And then until next time, don't forget to flex and flow, and I will see you soon. Bye.